of the Knowing Africa seminar series. My name is Shireen Hassam. I am the Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Politics, and I am located at the Institute for African Studies here at Carleton University in Ottawa. And I have an affiliated relationship with WISA at Wits University in Johannesburg. So it gives me really great pleasure to welcome you all to the seminar, and I want to begin with acknowledging that even though we are meeting virtually, we are nevertheless notionally meeting on a campus which is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I want to make that acknowledgement, particularly for those of us who come from Africa and understand the unresolved nature of relationships with regard to land and acknowledgement, and to point out that in many ways our seminar series and the work we do in the Institute of African Studies is very much rooted in these processes of not simply acknowledging, but moving beyond acknowledgement to understanding and to thinking about the ways in which we might create a world in which everyone is not only a citizen, but also epistemologically of equal value and treated with mutual respect. So thank you so much for joining us. Before I say more about the series, I just want to point out that we are recording the events. So if you have an issue with that, please let Femi know. And also to say, could you please mute yourself for the duration of the seminar, and I will, if you have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Right, so the Knowing Africa seminar series, launching today with this amazing presentation, is an attempt to think about Africa differently. It has a double meaning. There's a play on the notion of knowing Africa, on the senses of knowing Africa, that I think many people in African studies assume that Africa is known to them. But as Sabelo is going to, I think, probably problematize, our ways of knowing are not innocent of a range of power dynamics in the construction of knowledge. And so part of what we want to do here is to put those on the table and discuss those. But it's also a play in a different sense, and that is perhaps more the kind of Achille Mbembe injunction to all of us that we should be thinking about Africa for itself, Africa as a space which does know, which is a space of theory building and knowledge production. And I hope that in the series of seminars we are about to run, you will get a sense of that process as well. The series, we have 5 events in over the course of the fall semester, and we're going to hinge them particularly around the second meaning of Africa, that Africa is a space of theory making and knowledge production, around big thinkers and big books, big ideas from Africa. So you please keep an eye on future events, but immediately next week we will be hosting Sylvia Tamale on her new book on Afrofeminism and development. And she will be in conversation with Amina Mama, who is well known, I think, to all African studies scholars. Let me introduce Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni, our keynote for today. Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni is now professor of global epistemologies, quite a wordy, a long title, at the University of Bayreuth in Germany, but is known to many of us as a historian of Zimbabwe, and as professor at UNISA, where he held a chair and was responsible for leading the emergence of a whole series of interesting interventions in this rising new way of thinking about Africa around the term decolonization, which we'll hear a lot more about. Sabelo and Ndlovu-Gatsheni has published numerous books. I was talking with a friend about you, Sabelo, and he said, please ask him if he ever sleeps. So I don't know when you sleep, Sabelo, but you are indeed an exceedingly prolific scholar and have given us many interesting pieces of work to get our heads around, from your latest book, Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonization, which actually that's not your latest book. I think that was a couple of years ago. You've since produced an edited volume on rethinking and unthinking development with Busani Mpofu, and a new book on decolonization and knowledge production, Turning Over a New Leaf, a Routledge book, which just emerged today. Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then I'm so delighted to have our colleague at Carleton University, Professor Daniel McNeill, present some opening comments to get us to kickstart a discussion. Professor McNeill is in the history department, teaches Africana studies, Black Atlantic studies, race. His book on sex and race in the Black Atlantic has received excellent reviews. He was an Ida B. Wells Barnett visiting professor at DePaul University, and has most recently been a visiting professor at the Harriet Tubman Institute at York University. So thank you to both of you, and welcome to this amazing event. I'm going to hand over to Professor Ndlovu-Gatsheni to get us started. Sabelo.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation to speak at this important gathering, and thank you for the choice of the theme, which I think is a really challenging theme when I try to think about it. Perhaps let me try to be a bit organized, particularly for the purposes of Daniel to follow what I'm trying to do. Daniel, I will try to give, first of all, introductory remarks on the knowing Africa. Then from there, I'll move on to try to frame the issues in knowing Africa, particularly the epistemic question. Is it an epistemic question, or is it a political question? What is it, this question of knowing Africa? Then I will move on to talk about the politics of knowledge in Africa. Then thirdly, I will talk about a decolonization, and then end with the current conjuncture which we are facing in the space of knowledge, in the space of the universities. So those are the 4, if not 5, issues which I will speak about. And interestingly, Shireen, you have already spoken about what is the thinking behind Knowing Africa series. It already really provoked some thinking in me about who seeks and who wants to know Africa and why. And as I was thinking about that question, I thought about a book published by Wole Soyinka, I think in 2012, where he argued that Africa, unlike, say, the Americas, Africa was never discovered. It was already known as far as Wole Soyinka was concerned. And he went on to say, Europe always knew that there was Africa. What perhaps was discovered in Africa, what the individuals claim to have discovered, might be perhaps something like mountains, names of mountains, names of rivers, the mouth of River Nile, Niger, Congo, but not the continent itself. In other words, there is that argument that the continent, its existence was already known. But that actually then takes us to a number of, it provokes a number of questions, really, when you say knowing Africa, because we need to remember that the colonial anthropological and the ethnographic studies of Africa, which sought to know Africa for other purposes. And you are saying now we want to know Africa so as to know it differently, and also so as to make sure that Africa develops knowledge for itself. But still, we are not yet free from the discovery paradigm, knowing, claiming, conquering, and ownership. So sometimes when you raise the question of knowing Africa, a lot of people begin to think, is this person also thinking about the issue of claiming Africa, owning Africa, conquering Africa? Why should Africa be known? And you remember also the other reasons why people are very, very sensitive about the question of knowing Africa. The colonial question, the native question, knowing Africa in order to rule it, the knowing Africa in order for the conquering minority to rule over the majority. And this argument coming more clearly in the work of Mahmoud Mamdani, Define and Rule. So you need to know Africa and perhaps put it even in a magnifying glass. You put the native in a magnifying glass so that you know the native in and out for ulterior motives. But there was also another reason why there was this need to know Africa. The idea that you needed to know Africa so that you minimize their resistance, you minimize their anger, and you build on like the British building on their experience in India, coming now to then rethink the administrative systems which they are going to impose on Africa. Then when we come to the post-Second World War, we begin also to see another layer of knowing Africa as part of global imperial design and the rise of area studies, and also the emergence of a number of people known as Africanists who specialize on Africa, and they begin to actually produce knowledge from outside Africa. And then today, when we speak about knowing Africa also, you will remember that today, when you speak about knowing Africa, you are thinking perhaps in the context of the rise of the third scramble for Africa, which is also another fearsome moment in which the knowing of Africa might actually be knowing Africa for exploitative reasons. But as you said in your opening remarks, there is also this issue that Africa needs even to know itself. Africans need to know themselves after years of being alienated from themselves. And I thought I should put those as the opening remarks on the question of knowing Africa before I move on to the next question related to the same issue, the issue of is this question of knowing Africa really an epistemic question? And the epistemic questions always carry the power and the colonialities in itself. But I was thinking also about the issue of the relationship between knowledge and the reality, the relationship between knowledge and Africa. Or if you think more philosophically, the relationship between epistemology and ontology. And I was thinking really in terms of what Mignolo and Catherine Walsh speak about, that ontology is actually made of epistemology. In other words, is Africa really the Africa which we're talking about? Is it a product of particular epistemologies, particular knowledges? And this issue of what this entity called Africa is actually conceived epistemically, then articulated ideologically before it is ordered practically. So I was thinking really about that type of entry point, and that type of entry point takes me to a second set of ideas as we dialogue on the issue of knowing Africa. That one of the major central debates today, question in this question of knowing Africa, is also this idea that there are some of us who wants to actually think about Africa from a decolonial perspective. But every time we try to push that type of argument, we're always confronted with another question. The question that, but when we are thinking about decolonially, what is the relationship of decolonial thinking with the global economy of knowledge? And I think that we need to reflect maybe on that a bit, in the sense that there is this idea that we're living in a globally entangled world. And that globally entangled world, in other words, the knowledges have actually become entangled to the extent that it is very hard to think in terms of distinctions of the global north and the global south. And what we must actually be concerned about are the complexities and the multi-directional flows of knowledges, rather than this issue of knowledge from Africa, or knowledge from Asia, or knowledge from the Caribbean. And the central argument being that in the global economy of knowledge, we now live in a global village with a global economy. And what needs to be the focus is the dynamics and the often turbulent but not given simple dichotomies. And once we think that way, we then place the question of knowing Africa as part of knowing the world, perhaps knowing the world from Africa. And what is generally the problem with this type of thinking is that it then hides the whole issue of where do we think from. What in the decolonial studies they will talk about in terms of locus of enunciation, the geography and the biography of knowledge. This idea of a global economy, I don't think it then takes us away from the idea that we still think from somewhere. And the issue of existence of decontextualized knowledge with no context, I don't think it works. But it is an argument which cannot just be ignored. It's an important argument which we need to engage with in terms of critique. And I think one of the central critiques of this one is that even if we talk about the global economy of knowledge and knowing Africa and the place of Africa in that, there is always the resilient reality of a center in Europe and North America. There is that resilience, and I will try to demonstrate why I think even if we talk about global economy of knowledge, there is still a privileged place of Europe and North America in knowing Africa. And I want also to argue that there is also still an uneven intellectual division of labor, bearing in mind that as you were speaking, Shireen, you were speaking about developing theory from Africa, that even now when we think that way, there is still this hanging idea of Africa being engrossed in hunting and gathering of raw data. Most of the scholars based on the continent engaged more in field work or consistently gathering data. But when it comes now to processing and developing theory, then again the gaze changes into Europe and North America. And the issue of African scholars really working like they are applying theory from somewhere in order to understand Africa, and that produces a knowledge of Africa which is very problematic. And I think we will need to perhaps discuss that as well. Then the third point which I wanted to raise in terms of conceptual issues, is it possible to know Africa without reflection on its experience of the empire? I think that is a question which is also an important one, in the sense that when I'm talking about the empire, I'm here not talking about the physical empire, which might have been rolled back or dismantled, but I'm talking here specifically about what is emerging as the cognitive empire. The cognitive empire, which actually operates through the invasion of the mental universe of the colonized people. And in that way, even if we are located in Africa, but we still think like people who are outside Africa. We think about the continent, even if we are inside physically, but thinking epistemically from outside it. And that, I think, has a big problem, because it then links with my point on the politics of knowledge, which I wanted to talk about. To say, when we are thinking about knowing Africa, we'll need perhaps to go back to a most fundamental question of the formation of African intellectuals and African consciousness. And I think there it is important to pose a few questions. Why is it that there is a feeling that even Africans don't know themselves? How do you reach that there's that feeling of Africans, they don't know themselves? Because and when I pose that question, I want us to think about the formation of complex consciousness of African intellectuals, particularly the politics of their production, and where they are produced. And perhaps you link that to Thandika Mkandawire's his argument about the three generations of intellectuals, those who are produced, the two who are produced from outside, and the third ones who are produced from inside. And then you try to think about the consciousness of these intellectuals, particularly their transcultural elitism, and particularly the issue of the school system in which we're all involved, the school system which actually taught us to distance ourselves as much as possible from our history, distance as much as possible from our languages, distance as much as possible from our cultures, to the extent that even our names, most of our names, you can tell of a people who are actually distant from their cultures, from their histories, and from their languages. And it is these people whom are supposed to be thinking about Africa. And then you will find that two extremities then emerge. One is, on the one side, some of us, they tend to go the radical assimilation of the Eurocentric thinking, and then develop a radical dependency on European thought. Then there are some who then try to rectify that by going the other extreme, radical difference or radical alterity, in search of personhood, and also in search of what they will call indigeneity. And what we're trying to do is to find a way in between these three extremities as we try to think about Africa. But I wanted to proceed by then talking about how Africans have tried to know themselves, and they particularly thinking again in relation to intellectuals. And I wanted to argue that it looked like because of the experience of the continent, the experience of the people of Africa, the way they began to know themselves, it actually took the form of resistance. You will find the scholarship of resistance or scholarship for resistance. And because of that, there are some people who then pose these questions that, but African intellectuals, in their attempt to know themselves and to explain themselves, they become largely polemic, and sometimes they express deep anger in their expressions. And I like the way one historian answered this question of being polemic and angry. He said, but I understand why they are polemic and angry. And the reason is very clear for everyone. The people who need to be asked the question are those who are happy in this context of knowledge, which actually denigrates the whole of Africa. But what I wanted to then think about empirically is to then try to map out how African intellectuals have been producing knowledge. It's a very difficult task about their continent. I think the first strand which emerges poignantly in the attempt to write Africa by Africans is this idea of trying to challenge, first of all, thinking as a historian, colonial historiography. There is a rich literature which actually challenges colonial historiography, and the attempt to then counter the Eurocentric idea of history as starting with colonialism. And with the people like Cheikh Anta Diop, Theophilus Obenga, Jacob Ade Ajayi, Molife Kente Asante, and many others, educating us that, but African history predates colonialism. There is a rich, long history before colonialism. That's one strand. Then there is a second strand, which is also determined by our existential condition in relation to African, Islamic, and the Western cultures. And that one, again, you'll find that there is scholarship which tries actually to then think through how can Africans emerge out of these trajectories or experiences. And then you begin to find works like the works of Edward Wilmot Blyden, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro. And then you find works like Kwame Nkrumah, Conscientism. And then you find work like Ali Mazrui, The Africans, A Triple Heritage, whereby they are trying to think through these three moments in the life of Africa. And then it produces perhaps the earliest articulation of the concept of hybridity. And then the second question, which I also see coming through in African thinking about the continent and writing about the continent, is this issue of trying to explain why is it that even after the attainment of political independence, it looks like Africa is still under the burden of colonialism. And then you can go to the work of Kwame Nkrumah, neo-colonialism, particularly the concept of neo-colonialism. And that concept also preoccupied a number of scholars, including Samia Amin and many others, where they were now trying to explain why is it after attainment of political independence. And then that links to another important dynamic in African scholarship, the dynamic of explaining why is it that Africa is underdeveloped. And you have a rich scholarship again in that, on that line, beginning with Walter Rodney. And again, you can go to Samia Amin, Accumulation on a Wealthy Scale, Delinking in Unequal Development, and many others. Then you have another work by African and Black scholars, which looks at how Africa, how Europe invaded the mental universe of Africa, or how Europe colonized African minds. And we have a number of them, beginning with Frantz Fanon's work, Albert Memmi. You can go on to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, you can go on to Chinua Nzu, and many others who are thinking along those lines. Then we have people who then move on from how Europe underdeveloped Africa to how Europe ruled Africa. And what are the implications of the way Europe ruled Africa on the post-colonial condition. Then that's where you find the work of Mahmoud Mamdani, Citizens and Subjects, as well as Define and Rule. And that's where you find also the work of Achille Mbembe on the post-colony, trying to explain how Europe governed Africa or ruled Africa, as well as how post-colonial Africa governed itself in relation to the inherited colonial. And that also linked to a fifth dimension, in the knowledge, the people who were preoccupied with the colonial library or the colonial archive, and then you go to the work of V.Y. Mudimbe, you go to the work of Claude Ake, social sciences, imperialism, the theory of political development. I can go on and on, but what I'm trying to say is that we have been trying by all means to write Africa from our own vantage point. And you can find out that how Europe imposed particular social categories and the social formations, including gender and notions of sex, notions of sexuality, and the organization of family. Again, we have rich literature by people like Aifi Amadume, people like Sherin is here as well, Orionke, Ngiru, Nzwegu, and many others, Amina Mama, and many others actually engaging this other aspect of African knowledge. Then the other last part of scholars, you find people like Bakele Chilisa on indigenization of research method, confronting the sacred cow of production of knowledge, which is the methodology itself. And again, arguing that it still carries the coloniality. But what I'm trying to arrive at as a result of this, I don't want to bore you by talking about what you are familiar with, that as they were resisting, as they were producing this work, they were also producing ideological productions, such as negritude, Caveism, Pan-Africanism. I will jump that and then move to where I will try to move a bit slow, because I tried then to say, having said this, what is the emerging trend in knowing Africa, analytically speaking? And then I identified about 7 trends in knowing Africa. One is the colonial turn, the colonizers' model of the world, colonial historiography, and the Eurocentric idea of Africa. That is a major turn which actually produced a lot of literature which leads to the colonial library. Then we have the nationalist turn, which actually reacts to the colonial turn, but at the same time producing national subjectivities, issues of developmentalism, catching up, deracialization, Africanization, indigenization, as well as its darker sides as things like nativism and the Afrophobia also coming in there. Then we have a third turn in knowing Africa, the Marxist turn. And I always accept Marxism as a science of understanding capitalism as a key problem in the modern world. And you begin to see people trying to understand the African condition and the African realities from a class perspective, and the prominence of political economy. But you can also see the issue of the rise of Black Marxism and all these notions of dependency, center periphery. You can even think about people who were inventing another class, the subaltern class, history from below, and all that. Then we have the fourth way of thinking about Africa, which is the postmodernist turn, which actually starts in Europe with the Eurocentric critique of Eurocentrism. But if you read the work of people like Paul Atwalia, particularly his book, Out of Africa, he then begins to complicate that debate of saying postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-colonialism are European intellectual projections, whereby he then speaks about people like Michel Foucault, Camus, and Derrida, and the others, and they say, but these people are actually Maghrebian thinkers. They come from the Maghrebian region. And so he actually wants us to take them a bit different from just saying they are European thinkers. And this actually takes us to the post-colonial turn, particularly with its refusal of meta-narratives, as well as the transcendental identities like Black, and its emphasis on hybridity, fluidity, flexibility, and the plurality. Then you also have the feminist turn, which actually brings to the center of thinking about Africa the issue of gender relations as the category of power, sexual division of labor, patriarchy as a form of oppression, critique of the heteronormative normativity and the advocacy of plurally conceptions of sexual orientations, as well as the important concept of intersectionality and the idea of multiple oppressions. Then I think the turn which I've been trying to work around is now the decolonial turn. The decolonial turn, if you want to make a distinction between it and the post-colonial turn, is that it is not a mere critique. The decolonial turn is also an epistemic reconstitution. And I want to try to highlight that, to say we are critiquing, but at the same time we are trying to reconstitute the knowledge, and they were trying also to establish what we call in one of my book, epistemic freedom. And they were actually linking the epistemic question with the existential matter of re-existence after years of dismemberment. I could have actually stopped in this slide because that's where the issues are. But let me move on, and I will try to move to move very fast across what I think is already known, particularly the trajectories of the decolonial thinking. Because one of the questions which is always raised when we pose the question of decolonial thinking in relation to Africa, the question of saying it is not a new thing. And I think it's a non-question because there is nobody in his right senses who can say it's new. We're actually standing on the shoulders of giants here. And they were actually standing on building on events which actually took place on the continent, such as, you remember the Nairobi memo of 1968-1969, where Ngugi participated. And the fundamental question which they posed, why can't Africa be at the center so that we can view other cultures in relationship to it? And I find that to be an interesting take because it takes us back to the concept of locus of enunciation and situatedness. You can think of the Ipatan School of History, which successfully countered colonial historiography, and they even created a new methodology, particularly the oral methodology. And they engage on Africanization. You can think also of the Dar es Salaam School of History, and here I think I'm revealing myself as a historian by actually underscoring those movements more than anything else. The attempt to deploy class analysis and the political economy, as well as writing history from below. And the issue of interdisciplinarity and the reorganization of knowledge, which is very exciting to see that it is not a new attempt to reorganize knowledge. In Dar es Salaam, they attempted to reorganize knowledge to the extent that they produced the first fields of development studies, which were actually cutting across. And then you can also speak about such formations as the Codesria formation of 1973, an independent intellectual space to pursue a research and based on political economy and the Africa-focused research. And you can actually think about the key thinkers there and what they've offered us. People like Samia Amin, his rich and expansive archive framed by Marxist thinking, wealth systems, analysis, and political economy. You can think about Mamdani, who raised this question, this decolonial question, against starting Africa by analogy. And that becomes a very important concept even for decolonial thinking. And Tandinga Mkandawire and the African thinking on his thinking on African economic development, African developmental state, African intellectuals. You can think of Semoyo on the land question, land reform and the agrarian question, Achuma Feche on his consistent critique of anthropology, his contribution to national question, and many others. And I don't want to, but what I'm trying to say is we've been always trying to know Africa in different ways. And in the 70s, this is where it is interesting, because in the 70s, a lot of people emphasize that the African economy then plunged into crisis. And in the 70s, that's when military and the one-party state dictatorships actually take the center stage. But during that very time, when neocolonialism was intensifying, you'll find that there was also intellectual resistance to imperialism and the neocolonialism, with the people like Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney, Samia Amin, Dani Nabutere, Bala Mohammed, Zonkola Ntavanja, Mzala Nxumalo, and many others, really thinking very deeply about the political economy, the Marxist thinking. And during that time, you will also see important debates emerging. I've already spoken about the debate on class, state, and imperialism. But we need also to think about the debates that were taking place at Maputo, at Sabelo University, and many other places, such as the Southern African Political Economy Trust by Ibo Mandaza, who also had links with the Dar School. And what makes me to think about this period as important, because it is during that period that there was even a journal of African Marxists. And that shows that how important that work was. But at the political level, then you will see also some people were even justifying some military coups as anti-imperialist military coups, like Rawlings of Ghana's military coup. He was justifying. But I don't want then to talk about the crisis. I think you are all familiar with the crisis. But what I can only say is that the crisis, which actually comes on the heels of the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism, and the corporatization, actually becomes a sort of a gap in the decolonization. People just move. A lot of thinkers move to the right as a result of that. Universities, public universities, tend to collapse as a result of that. And the knowledge itself about Africa, there is beginning to be thinking about knowledge in relation to profit. And because of that, you will begin to see arts, humanities, and the social sciences in Africa being asked to justify their existence during that period, because they were said that there's nothing developmental about them. They don't produce profit. And you can see that becomes a very sad moment in the African intellectual sphere. And I'm raising that because I want also to then say, why are we in where we are now in terms of our knowledge of Africa? Why are we the universities, which were supposed to be actually the incubator of the ideas about Africa? What was the problem with the universities which were in Africa? To the extent that we still continue to say, knowing Africa even now, we will find that, first of all, I've always tried to put this argument that we tended to have universities in Africa, not African universities. In other words, the universities which we had, they were part of the modern world system, and they were located in Africa, but were they of Africa? That is the question which still troubles us today. And you'll find that today, perhaps we can identify three crises of the institutions which produce knowledge, particularly the universities. The hegemonic crisis, in which the functions of the universities are actually being questioned. The idea of producing high culture, elitism, universal knowledge, excellence, being countered by those who are saying, but we need to emphasize more relevance, social justice, and empowerment. And you will see that question of, should these people who are in the universities operate as academics, or they should actually operate as intellectuals, whether there is a difference between those two. And I think the work of Mamdani, he has tried to give us the difference between the two when he talks about the work of Al-Mazrui and the work of Walter Rodney. One saying Al-Mazrui was more of an academic excited by ideas, whereas Walter Rodney was an intellectual who wanted to embed himself in the people's struggles and in changing the world. And that is still with us up to today in trying to say, but what is the purpose of a university? But that is linked also to the second problem, the crisis of legitimacy of the university. I think across the world, that one is not even an African problem. The issue of the complicity of universities in some of the inimical historical problems of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, whereby then it delegitimizes the university itself, to the extent that some universities were even keeping statues of imperialists at their center, like the University of Cape Town. And that actually then have created a paralysis, a legitimacy crisis for the university, which they need to really recover as quickly as possible. And the one which is well-known one is the institutional crisis of the university. Should it continue to be talking about autonomy? Should it continue to be an ivory tower? Should it continue to use academic freedom? Or should it shift from academic freedom to epistemic freedom? Academic freedom being about rights and epistemic freedom being about justice. And I want to end then by talking about where we are today. And I hope I've not taken too much of your time. Of course, thinking about where we are today, from where I'm standing, I will build, of course, on the roads must fall and the fees must fall, a moment in South Africa, whereby they raised the very question of the idea of the university, the very question of the iconography, the very question of the funding of higher education, the very question of indigenous languages, the very question of institutional cultures, knowledge, curriculum, as well as the labor question. But I want us to say, having done all what we're doing, as Shireen, when we opened, she said, we want to develop a new thinking about Africa. How do we develop that new thinking about Africa? I think a lot of people say they are tired of us talking about diagnosis of issues. What they want now is a prescription. And my argument is always, I think you cannot do one without the other. A good prescription will always be informed by good diagnosis of the problem. So I will try then to speak about some of the key issues which we need to deal with in a practical sense. When people speak about Eurocentrism, what exactly are they speaking about in a practical sense? Are they speaking about over-representation of ideas from one province of the world? And then they are actually saying there is need to deprovincialize Europe so that you deprovincialize Europe so that you allow other provinces of the world to also emerge. Because what Europe has done is that it has moved into the center of the world and they pretended to be the center. And the idea is really to then rethink deeply about how to move Europe in such a way that it becomes an important part of the province of the world, but not the center of the world. And I think we need to think practically, how do we do that? I think the second most important practical question is that should we think about Africa from a disciplinary point of view? And the second, related to that, how relevant is disciplinary knowledge for the problems which we are facing today? And I think there we'll need perhaps to go back even to a fundamental idea from Michel Foucault, who argued that modern disciplines emerge in modern history at a particular moment to deal with particular problems. And if we accept that argument, therefore we need to ask ourselves searching questions about, are the current disciplines really relevant to what we're trying to deal with? Their constitutive formation, their fitness for purpose, their relevance, and the value for money for those who are also to think about what do we do with the dominant knowledge? We continuously speak about dominance of European knowledge. What do we do with it? Should we just remove and replace? What type of personality should we take? And again, I seem to be raising more questions than actually answering them. And then the very issue of which is even the most important task for us today is to rethink thinking itself, bearing in mind that there is a normative foundation for theory itself, and that normative foundation in my reading is still predicated on issues of salvation, civilization, progress, social evolution, emancipation, and development. And I'm thinking it is important that we think, how do we think beyond that? And I think one of the major problems why I started talking about the formation of African intellectuals, I was thinking about this issue of miseducation and re-education. Not only of those who come as a student, but for us as intellectuals, we need really to engage as individuals in unlearning some of the things which we learned. And I want to conclude by saying, this moment which we're meeting, the moment which we're meeting is a moment of profound dissatisfaction with its dominant and hegemonic knowledge. And if you can think from it might even be an interregnum, an epistemic break in knowledge. But the challenge is that this knowledge which is exhausted is refusing to die, and the new one is difficult for us to produce the new one. So there is this idea that we need to think deeply about why is it that we rely on knowledge of a minority, perhaps one-fifth of the world. And the issue of epistemologies of the global south is then to say, why don't we actually take the whole gamut of knowledge from the global south, which actually constitute 4/5 of the world? And I want to end by saying this issue takes us to the present challenge of reconstitution of knowledge, involving embracement of ecologies of knowledges, thinking across traditions and adopting perhaps mosaic epistemologies. I will stop here for now.
Oh, thank you so much, Sabelo. That was a tour de force. Initially I was going to say you've given us an excellent map with which to read these issues, but by the end I felt you had given us a whole atlas. Yeah. So I'm handing over to Daniel McNeil, who I hope will help us get into the conversation. Daniel.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Sabelo. I'd echo those comments that was a wonderfully rich talk that was both concrete and expansive, that encouraged us to reflect and think deeply about the politics of knowledge and how that's used to control, to subjugate, to regulate, and also invited us to think about affect, legitimate rage, and also an ethical discourse about revolutionary practice. And I've furiously scribbled some notes. I'll maybe talk a little bit about 3 intellectuals inside and outside of academia who I think may talk back to some of these issues and stimulate some further conversation, and then hopefully grapple or work towards maybe 1 or 2 questions that can help kick off the discussion. So the first person that I thought of during this talk was Lewis Gordon, public intellectual, noted commentator on Fanon existentialism, who's developed a genealogy of Black intellectual traditions, as well as invited us to think about shifting the geography of reason by coming to terms with the hegemony of disciplinary decadence in the university. So for Lewis Gordon, for thinking through a Black intellectual tradition, he invites us to say, well, there is no Black intellectual tradition, there are multiple and overlapping traditions. He helps us to think about Black nationalism, helps us to think about a liberal line, a radical line, as well as a conservative line, although that tends to be high-profile libertarians. And then he talks about contemporary Black intellectual traditions as well, helping us to think about Black feminism, Black religious thought, Black pragmatism, Black existentialism, Black postmodernism, cultural and queer studies, Afrocentrism, as well as Africana thought. And I think part of that genealogy, I think, will lead to a question about Sabelo still uses tables, right, to diagnose a problem. So as much as we're thinking about the problems of, well, the politics of knowledge that is categorized and labeled, African cultures and civilizations and ways of life, there's still a desire to use tables to talk about models of the university and African intellectual productions. And I was wondering how, in conversation with scholars like Lewis Gordon or intellectuals such as Lewis Gordon, what methodological and ethical discourses have been useful to continue to use such schemas while guarding against the ever-present danger of oversimplifying messy lived realities and experiences. So that might be one way to enter into the discussion. And I guess another way would be to think about critiques of policy. So I'm thinking here of David Graeber's work, prominent, anarchist and anthropologist who recently passed. And he has a tiny manifesto against policy. And he argues that the notion of policy presumes a state or governing apparatus which imposes its will on others. Policy is the negation of politics. Policy is by definition something concocted by some form of elite which presumes it knows better than others how their affairs are to be conducted. By participating in policy debates, the very best one can achieve is to limit the damage, since the very premise is inimical to the idea of people managing their own affairs. And I think that might help us to get at this idea around self-activity, self-knowledge, knowledge production, but also Lewis Gordon's ideas around disciplinary decadence, which for Gordon is the phenomenon of turning away from living thought, which engages reality and recognizes its own limitations, to a deontologized or absolute conception of disciplinary life. The discipline becomes, in solipsistic fashion, the world. In more concrete terms, we can think about the literary scholar who criticizes work in other disciplines as not literary. The sociologist who rejects other disciplines as not sociological. And the historian who asserts that history is the foundation as everything. And I guess pushing that a little bit, you alluded to some of your ambivalence about the label historian, maybe. And so thinking more about where you're coming from in terms of your disciplinary perspective and how you cultivate a critique of disciplinary decadence may be helpful for inviting further reflection. And then lastly, the other thing that spoke to me in your talk was grappling with this idea of what is Africa. So you made the comment, Africans don't know themselves, right? And I was thinking about that through a recent article by Carol Phillips, where he kind of briefly alludes to the poems of a Harlem Renaissance and African Americans wrestling with the question, what is Africa to me? He ends the article by thinking through this idea that, his last line is, I don't detect any contemporary African writers extending much sympathy or time in the direction of diasporan individuals who are worried about what Africa means to them. And given the evidence of this diasporan musing, who can blame them? And what I was also curious about is how you'd respond to someone who wanted to push this question about knowledge further into reflections about affect. That is to say, what would it mean to ask not whether Africans know themselves, but whether it would be helpful to ask how Africa makes us feel.
Wow, thank you so much, Stephen. Sorry, Daniel, that takes us into a whole, a much even larger, although in some ways more specific set of questions, things we might direct it to. And I certainly, you know, coming into the conversation as an African feminist, of course, the deployment of rage is a very productive theory-making exercise. Without it, we'd not have feminism. So, you know, just to underscore that. So we have close to 100 participants. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to ask a question yet. I know that it's quite difficult. I'm going to ask Isaac Como if he would kick us off with a question. Femi, could you unmute Isaac Como? Maybe while that's happening, Sabelo, do you want to respond at all at this point?
To just reflect a bit on what Daniel has just said. I think I won't pick it in terms of the order in which he actually presented it. Mm-hmm. I think it's an important question, really, the question of disciplinary decadence. I'm happy he brought Louis Aragon, and I engage with his work as well. And I also found that concept of disciplinary decadence very important. But my take was that it also raises an important question of, should we continue to engage in disciplinary debates, or should we deal with the human problems? Because the major problem with thinking disciplinary is that it gives you a spectacles and a lens in which to see the world, which sometimes is always very partial. Even a simple thing like an accident happening outside, then you hear somebody saying, as a psychologist, as a historian, as an economist, I'm thinking this way. In other words, failing to think outside the discipline. But the other thing which I found to be very, very, very interesting is this issue which you raised about policy. I've never attempted really to offer policy because I think policy is too prescriptive without telling us what exactly it is relating to. And you had a critique of also my use of tables in my last article. I think I'm not sure whether I was actually developing schemes or schemas, but I was trying to actually to summarize some things which could not be, if I wrote them in elaborate prose, the paper was going to be longer than what was required. So it's not really, but I take it that it might actually have some methodological connotations. But the last issue which I wanted to comment on, I don't want people to go home saying, I said Africans don't know themselves. I think they know themselves, but there is a feeling for some people to want to think for them. And this actually creates a problem in the sense that I was trying to arrive at this question of sidelining thinkers who are actually embedded in the issues which we're discussing and taking their work seriously. That's why I tried to go through, again, in a rather problematic, schematic way, the work which has already been done. But what about if we listen to that work and try to really not do a very fast reading across it, try to really get got theories from there, rather than to always jump to draw theories from somewhere else. That's what I was trying to do. And I think also that might link to what Achille Mbembe once raised some time ago about the problem of African self-writing. I always have a very conflicted relationship with that statement, because if you are critical of it, then you are saying there are some people who must write about Africans than Africans themselves. So I think we need to have a balance there. Of course, self-writing is like writing your own biography or something. You can sometimes always visibilize what is positive about you and leave others. So it's always like that. But I think we cannot dismiss the whole concept of self-writing. It's important, and the self-knowledge is very important as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a few people at once. Isaac Como, and then Mirella Kami, Oscar Abers, and then Spamandla Zondi. So, Isaac, please go ahead and speak. Isaac, or am I pronouncing it wrongly? Isaac? We can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
I've done it. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Now, the issue is this, that first of all, hi to Professor Ndlovu and hi to everybody, and thanks for inviting me. I think one thing which we've actually got to look at, the way I look at the whole issue, is that this thing here, it is complex, and not only complex, that I think we are actually looking at the whole thing from a very, very skewed point of view. Now, I'll take this to an issue of modernity. When it comes to modernity, there was a very good presentation by a Russian political philosopher, and when he talked about modernity as it was, which was based in the European, Western European point of view or basis, and this was basically driven by the American cultural and social imperialism. But then he says that today's world, I mean to say that the global south, most countries have come up, those are the Asiatics, of course, with a theme of plural modernism, whereby these countries, they've actually seen the need to be modernistic, or to modernize, sort of to fit into the global village. And they've come with their own concepts of modernity, which are based upon their ontological, epistemic realities and others, cultural, social realities. But I think this is where, as Africans, we fail, in the sense that we tend to be engrossed, which is right, with the issue of trying to redefine ourselves from a historical point of view. Yet we actually miss the most important thing, that the world is changing fast and is actually getting closer. And you've got to fit into this world, yeah, with our knowledges. But then these knowledges have got to be in consonant with the present reality, be it the reality, the economic reality, the cultural reality. And I think that's where we actually, we've got a difficulty. We do not look at the whole process as it being a dynamic process, and we tend to deal with it as a static process and looking at things from a static point of view. I think that's a very big challenge which we are facing, which our intellectuals are facing. I do not know how Professor Sabelo would actually sort of take my remarks.
Thank you very much. Mirella Kami.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hey. So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you to everyone involved. This was an incredible talk, an incredible presentation, and of course, thank you to Dr. Sabelo. So my question is, I was wondering if, Dr. Sabelo, you could speak more to the question of provoking the question of knowing Africa as it pertains to African indigeneity. So how or can one think about knowing Africa from outside of the continent So I'm referring to, and I am personally speaking from a place of, as somebody that identifies as, you know, as a African, sort of African diaspora identity group, is thinking about African knowledge, or is accessing an African epistemology in all of its complexities, is it specifically and inherently an in situ practice or ability?
Thank you very much. Oscar Avers.
Thank you. My question is actually related to the previous one. And I also want to say thank you to the organizers and also to Professor Sabelo for his speech. I'd like to depart from the positioning of Walter Rodney as being a scholar who was passionate about the development of the people. And then I want to link this development to the role that knowledge has in the development. And my concern, colleagues, is that not just in Africa, but possibly globally, but really accentuated in Africa, and I can say this from the perspective of South Africa, that it's really a very small percentage of the populace that has access to higher education. So my question to Professor Sabelo, and to follow up on the previous speaker, is what is his perspective of the sharing of this powerful and possibly disciplinary knowledge, not just among scholars and agents who work in the university, but the masses of people, the masses of African people? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oscar. And then Sipamandla. Of course you have.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sabelo. I just wanted to just check two things for you, from you. Is it possible also to add in the traditions that you raised, a particularly interesting tradition for me, where Africans were trying to thinking about the world, and in that process hoping that that would create a space for Africa. I'm thinking about ideas like globaletics, the world as a multiplicity of things, and Africa as part of it. The idea that they're not just navel-gazing and looking at what can be done with Africa, but thinking about how to redefine the world to make it possible for a new Africa to emerge in that world. Because that's kind of what Mazrui was, so before he passed away, was going into about a new global culture, a new global civilization. And the fundamental interest there was how to create possibilities for Africa to work in. The second one, and a quick one as well, is how we should be careful not to lose a sight of that tradition of thinking that takes place in the pre-colonial period, but takes place in the literary period in North Africa, the work of Ibn Khalid, Al-Koni, and all of that, but they belong to a period that might not fit in the periods that are there. And lastly, could it be that we could think about decolonial turn as slightly different from other turns in the sense mostly that it is building upon previous terms. It is not seeking to outshine other terms. So it builds upon the nativist one, it builds upon the Marxist, it builds upon the post-colonial. It borrows from all of those to create a possibility to think in a more collective way. Am I right? Thank you.
Thank you, Spamandla. And then if you don't mind, Sabelo, I'll just take one last one, and then we'll have your response. Ayokunmi, speaking from Nigeria.
Yes, thank you, Professor Shuren. I appreciate Professor Sabelo for the stimulating presentation. So coming from the background, from the literary background of decolonization, I wish to ask, and with reference for writers like Chinua Achebe, Ndlovu-Gatsheni, just like as Dr. Sabelo mentioned during the presentation, Birago Diop and the likes, and who have written works, as responses and to complement this issue of decolonization. I wish to ask, is it possible for African writers to write independent of contesting Eurocentric ideologies or writing back to the empire? So is it possible to discuss Africa as original without necessarily, contesting Eurocentric ideologies or the discourses, the conventional discourses about writing back to the empire or contesting with, with the European world about the identity of Africa?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. That's quite a lot for you to deal with, Sabelo, but I wonder if I could hand it to you.
Yes, thank you.
Make just a closing comment, really.
Thank you. I'm always a disappointment when it comes to answering questions because I raise more questions than answers. I think the important part of these questions is that they are related in a way, starting with the Komos question on the elephant in the room, the modernity, the issue of should we think about modernity as plural? I think there is a lot of work done already on plural modernities, alternative modernity, and the transmodernity. So the issue is really not to be against modernity, but the decolonial take is to raise also the underside of modernity as a key problem, because by the time it deposits all these positive issues of popular education and everything, it was also doing something else. So it depends where you think from about modernity, but it has nothing to do with being against it. It is actually to approach it critically, as far as I'm concerned. And when you were speaking about modernity, I also thought about these two broad schools: incomplete decolonization and incomplete modernity. Others arguing that our task is really to complete modernity so that Africa catches up with the Europe and the North America, and the others saying, but to continue pursuing the idea of modernity as it is conceived Eurocentrically is really to be pursuing something which is very dangerous. And the interesting part is it is not only scholars from the global south who are saying that, or scholars from Africa who are saying that. Even some scholars within Europe are very critical of the very project of modernity itself. So I don't think it's really an issue of Africans trying to resist modernity. And secondly, the issue of let's adapt to the present reality as though the present reality comes as a natural phenomenon. But when I started, I spoke about reality perhaps being an epistemic creation, particular types of thinking actually creating particular realities. And if indeed it is like that, then we move away from the question of essences and the naturalism to say, but what is called the reality here is a construction of particular thought and particular power dynamics and the particular notions of being. And because of that, we need to be actually very critical of those instead of actually adapting to it. This issue of adapt or perish, or adapt or you perish, I think is also a very problematic position. Adapting to what? That is the major problem. And the last reflection on that, modernity as it created the modern industrialized societies of Europe and the North America, I think the trajectory of how they reached there is now known. From slavery, colonialism, neo-colonialism, Cold War, should we really aspire for that, or should we aspire for something else? And I know that the difficulty related to that is that modernity also is seductive. There are some people who are enchanted by it. There are some who are disenchanted by it. I think the decolonial approach is really that of saying, let's adopt a very critical and a questioning mind on this issue. Then the issue of Africa and the indigeneity, knowing Africa, immediately you raise that question. I thought I must actually come back and say, perhaps we need also to problematize the whole issue of inside and outside, because that can be very problematic, I think, analytically, of saying perhaps there are people who are inside and the people who are outside. I think when we're speaking epistemically, we're thinking about the location in relation to power dynamics, not the geographical location of the thinking. So there is a problem which is very, very familiar, whereby even people who are on the receiving or the oppressive side of power, sometimes they think as those who are on the oppressive or on the dominant power side of power. And that's the success of coloniality. So I don't want here to leave people with the idea that there are people who are inside, there are people who are outside. I think I needed to clear that. If I created that impression, it was not intended. I think you can think about Africa from many locations, socially, many locations epistemically, many locations geographically. You can think about Africa that way. You can think progressive about it, and you can think reactionary even if you are located geographically inside the continent. So I think it's important to think that way. Then the other one was a direct question, very direct but very difficult. How do we take this knowledge to the people, to the world? I think that's where this issue where I spoke about that. But we need to define what exactly is the problem in the knowledge domain. And I wanted, academics are sometimes very good in always pointing to problems outside them. And what I was trying to do today was actually to try to own some of the problems. And to say the way I was produced myself as an intellectual might actually be very problematic to the extent that it actually alienates me from what you called the people or the masses who are outside the university. And what we're trying to do with the decolonial project is try to actually disrupt that idea that knowledge is in the university. As far as I'm concerned, knowledge is actually in society, is not within the university. And how intellectuals move out of the university into society, it must actually shift from the missionary type of thinking whereby you are going to civilize. Is needed to go to the communities to learn and they make them really learning communities, and then we arrive perhaps at what they call co-production of knowledge with the communities. We're learning from them, and I think that's what we're trying to drive at. Then for Prof. Zondi, I think indeed I like that reference also to the North African tradition, which I think I didn't put in what I was trying to draw. And as I said at the beginning, when Shireen was talking about the D's of the decolonial 10, and I said I'm actually trying to build that, and it's an ongoing work. And indeed, you are right. I think the period of Ibn Khaldun and the other thinkers, we need actually to take it into account. It might actually take us somewhere. Then the issue of the decolonial 10, as I said in my presentation, I said where it differs perhaps with other 10s is not that it is a new 10, is that there is the constitutive whereby we're trying to construct epistemically, and they're also bringing the existential question, and they're also shifting perhaps from academic freedom to epistemic freedom. But I agree with you totally that is not really like a rupture in the traditions of thought. That's why I take people like Samia Amin as both Marxist and decolonial. I take people like Walter Rodney as Marxist and decolonial, and I actually see that the decolonial actually is built on mainly on Black Marxist thought, and it actually is also built on Black feminists. The whole issues of intersectionality, entanglement, and all these things, they are there in the decolonial thinking. So I think fundamentally knowledges don't actually, they don't come in boxes, they come entangled. And I agree with you that I'm not creating an impression whereby we then have this issue of deep opposition between I am post-colonial, you are decolonial. That can a lot of problems. We're building on each of the previous knowledges. And then my friend from Nigeria asked about a very important question. Are we going to continue writing back, as I said in the beginning, that I see African scholarship developing as resistance, or they can be independent, autonomous African writing? I don't think I have an answer on that one. The issue being that intellectuals always react to what is available at the moment. And when you are trying to write independent, then the reality of colonialism is there, the reality of patriarchy is there, the reality of sexism is there. How will you then try to map something which does not react to those? I don't think is possible. I think intellectuals write in relation to what actually exists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabelo. That was fantastic, and we really did make you work very hard. It is true that you have raised many, many questions for us, but nobody ever said it was going to be easy. So thank you for raising those very big questions, because I think we are in a moment in which we do have to, as you say, see ourselves as entangled, rather than operating in some separate little corner. And once you see those entanglements, then you have to be in a very large conversation. So thank you very much for your work. Thank you everybody for your patience and for going well beyond the time that we usually allocate for the seminar, sign of the success. So thank you very much. Thank you, Sabelo. And we hope to see you again in our seminar program, and when it's possible to host you in person at Carleton University.
Thank you so much. Thank
you very much. Thank you, Daniel, for your comments, and thank you so much, Femi, for holding our entire seminar together technologically. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.